is Kenneth Kendler. Last year, I gave a presentation on the history of psychiatric genetics that focused on specific episodes and individuals important in the history of our field. Today, I'm going to give a deeper dive into a single episode. The title, as you can see, is The Beginnings of the Debate Between the Mendelians and the Biometricians in Psychiatric Genetics. I'll be focusing on 4 individuals: David Heron, Carl Pearson, Abraham Rosenoff, and Charles Davenport, and I will be covering a fairly short time period, the years 1913 to 1914, so think the years just leading up to the First World War. Now, it's not often that psychiatric genetics work gets into the New York Times, but here, if you were to open up the magazine section of the Sunday New York Times on November 9th, 1913, you would see this big full-page spread titled, "English Expert Attacks American Eugenic Work. Teachings are pronounced fallacious and actually dangerous to social welfare by Dr. David Heron of the Galton Laboratory, London. Dr. Charles Davenport makes a vigorous reply." Here's a portrait of Charles Davenport we will get to know somewhat better. And these are 2 buildings that was then the Eugenics Record Office at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which has developed into a molecular powerhouse in more recent years. I want to introduce you to the 4 key characters. Aaron Rosenoff was a Jewish emigre trained in medicine and psychiatry in the United States. We will be tracking his career in some detail later in the talk. Charles Davenport was a major American Mendelian in the early 20th century. He was at this point director of the eugenics lab at the Cold Spring Harbor. There's a great deal of literature on Davenport's life. David Heron, much less well known, was a Scottish-born statistician who trained as a Galton Research Fellow under Pearson at the Galton Research Labs of National Eugenics at the University of London, and he performed the first ever quantitative genetic study of insanity in 1907. Carl Pearson, I think, does not need much introduction. He obviously was a major figure in the history of statistics, and in these years was directing the Galton Labs at London. Now, all of the individuals here were ardent eugenicists. There are aspects of eugenics and arguments that played into this. I do not emphasize this in my presentation, but if you read the primary sources, you will hear more about that here. Now, what do these folks look like? This is a portrait of A.J. Rosenoff. Not the best, but you can get an image of him. This is a picture of Charles Davenport, now really quite clear, and you saw a portrait of him in the New York Times as well. Here is, I could not find a picture despite much effort for David Heron, so I give you his first monograph, historically a quite important document that I may cover in a future lecture, our first study of the statistics of insanity and the inheritance of the insane diathesis, which was a quantitative study using Pearson's tetrachoric correlation of insanity. And finally, Carl Pearson. Here he is with his family, the son Egan, who we'll hear more of, and his daughter, I think a very nice photo of Pearson. So let's give a little bit of historical background to what is going on at this time period. After the rediscovery of Mendel's laws in 1900, an intense and often personal debate ensued about the relative values of biometrical genetics and Mendelian genetics as applied to plants, animals, and especially humans. As the traditional histories tell us, this debate was largely an English affair centered on 2 chief protagonists. There was Gregory Bateson on the Mendelian side and Carl Pearson as the lead biometrician. For those of you not familiar with these terms, the biometricians emphasized quantitative traits and thought that you should study relationships among relatives by calculating correlations, especially Pearson's both product moment and tetrachoric correlations. On the other hand, the Mendelians emphasized investigation of discontinuous traits, and they were interested in Mendelian patterns of those traits. In essence, what we are seeing now is a small American skirmish as a part of this much broader controversy between these 2 fields. And here I will give you a bibliography at the end, but these are probably the 2 best reports about this overall background argument if you wish to follow them up further. Now, we really get started here with this monograph. This monograph sort of lit the fire that exploded in the controversy that we saw in the New York Times. Notice the dates of publication. This was initially printed in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1911 and reprinted in the Eugenics Office. And the key author there was A.J. Rosenoff. The title, A Study of Heredity of Insanity in the Light of Mendelian Theory. This was the first major pedigree study of psychiatric illness ever done applying Mendelian rules. It was a couple of years ahead of Rudin's key publication in 1916. A little bit of background: with the support of Davenport and his team of field workers from the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, Rosenhoff and Orr studied 72 pedigrees who were ascertained through psychotic patients admitted to Kings Park State Hospital in New York, which in fact is where Rosenhoff was working then. They studied, quote, insanity and allied neuropathic conditions, unquote, which he claimed in this publication was inherited as a Mendelian autosomal recessive trait. And of course, by that we mean fully penetrant. Models of incomplete penetrance were not being seriously considered at this time. Now, Rosenhoff did not attempt to uncover the mode of transmission of specific psychiatric disorders. So this deviated certainly from the Rudin school that looked especially at dementia precox and manic depressive insanity, and many of the other subsequent genetic investigations we are used to. Rather, he focused on a very broad phenotype that he termed the neuropathic constitution. And what he tested the Mendelian model by examining segregation rates in SIBSHIPs from these pedigrees as a function of their mating type. He studied 206 matings with a total of 1,097 offspring, and any well parent with a neuropathic offspring was assumed to have a heterozygote genotype. So just that you're familiar with these, D stand for the wild type, and R is the risk allele, so a DR is a heterozygote. And he focused on 6 mating types. And you can read these out, of course. These are going to be, given the recessive model that he assumed, is affected by affected, affected by heterozygote, affected by a well homozygote, heterozygote by heterozygote, well by heterozygote, and well by well. And from simple algebra understanding Mendelian predictions, you have these percentages expected in the offspring of those individual mating types, from 0% to 100%. Now, what's the phenotype that Rosenhoff studied? And this is obviously a little bit from the monograph itself. In studying any neuropathic defect, one must bear in mind that its clinical manifestations will vary with the personality of the subject and the conditions of environment. It is indeed a notorious fact that most of the so-called clinical entities are remarkable for the variety of their manifestations. This fact has necessitated the introduction in clinical practice of the conception of neuropathic equivalence. And that will be a major topic that we will discuss further. Now, this is the key results from that monograph that I'll go through, but I redo this in a clearer format. But in effect, these are the mating types, with the B and B1 differing about whether you know that the person is a heterozygote because they have an affected offspring, at least that's the assumption of their model, and one in which you assume that, but you can actually read off the expected versus the observed. And in the next figure, you'll be able to see that more clearly. So if you scan your eyes down these columns, you'll note that there's a fairly significant deviation here, but for most of the other columns, and somewhat there's moderately good agreement between. Now, there was no chi-square test, even though that had been invented a number of years ago, no statistics observed, but from these pedigrees, Rosenhoff and Orr reached the following conclusion. As is shown in the table, the correspondence between theoretical expectation and actual findings is in some cases exact, and in all cases remarkably close. It would seem then that the fact of the hereditary transmission of the neuropathic constitution as a recessive trait in accordance with the Mendelian theory may be regarded as definitively established. Let's look at some of the pedigrees. They're all presented in the monograph, and I'm only going to give you a selection, but just to get a clue about what the meanings of the symbols are. So the clear squares and circles are going to be normal progeny. Those with a little circle in them are a normal subject without progeny, and so they can't, according to their own system, know whether the person is a normal homozygote or a heterozygote. And then these are normal subjects with a neuropathic progeny, which by their definition have to be heterozygote. And then the affecteds, who need to be homozygotes, are the full shaded ones. And then there are ones about died in childhood and other. And again, you can study this at your leisure if you so wish. So I'm only going to show, I think, 4 pedigrees, but working through those although maybe a little tedious, will be helpful to get a sense of the data. So we always have the proband who is hospitalized at King's Hospital in this primary civship here. In this case, we have a manic depressive insanity case hospitalized. Then all the affected, let's go through those first. This woman has a sister who is described as very nervous, which meets their criteria or for neuropathic trait, has a mother with epilepsy, has a maternal grandfather with epilepsy, and has a paternal grandmother who is described as, quote, hysterical when a girl, had ideas someone was trying to poison her. The only other people here are the obligatory heterozygotes by Rosenoff's system. And again, because they had affected offspring, assuming the recessive inheritance, those are obligatory heterozygotes. So that's the first pedigree. Second pedigree here, again, number 7 is the proband with manic depressive illness. And this is, again, a heterozygote by ill individuals. So according to Mendelian theories, these should on average have 50% affected. We have, with this affected male proband, a sister who is described as, quote, easily excited and a nervous temperament, which is assumed to be neuropathic, has an affected father with recurrent melancholia with insomnia, having spent 5 months in a sanatorium, has a paternal uncle who is described as a crank, has a maternal aunt described as having convulsions, and a maternal uncle described as convulsions. Note that these also both meet criteria for neuropathic trait and are considered affected, and then an affected paternal grandfather with senile deterioration, presumably due to some kind of dementing illness like Alzheimer's. Okay. Third pedigree. This is obviously now 4 generations, so much richer. We have the core civship here, and here we have, it looks like a double proband family. So both 9 and 10, which is recurrent melancholia with suicide attempts and manic depressive insanity, the sister and brother. And they have one affected sister who is described as attack of depression with suicidal tendencies. This is a homozygote by homozygote mating, with the father having had fainting spells and the mother having been diagnosed as recurrent attacks of depression. There's a paternal grandfather who is described as, quote, money mad, very cruel, very miserly, though wealthy, left much of his money to a housekeeper. And then we have a maternal great-grandfather who's described as alcoholic. We have a couple of individuals here who are marked as heterozygotes because of their obligatory offspring, because they had offspring. So number 4 had a daughter with fainting spells, not drawn on the pedigree, but the authors are willing to assume that she must be a heterozygote because of that. And this uncle had a feeble-minded and, quote, queer son, and again is assigned a obligatory heterozygote. And then these parents, because they were intervening between these, must have been heterozygote to transmit the recessive trait. And this is the last and obviously a much broader pedigree. So here we have a very rich, dense pedigree here in which number 13 is a woman who is the proband with dementia praecox. She has 2 affected older brothers who was alcoholic, actually both of them, affected younger brother with a highly nervous temperament, worries and also with alcoholism, and number 11 worries over things, his sister with blue spells. The father is described as neuropathic with a highly nervous temperament and irritable. One of the uncles is a nervous temperament, alcoholic, another uncle, highly nervous, and then a sister who has a daughter who's nervous. So she is considered to be an obligatory heterozygote. And then we have a very dense pedigree here in the maternal line, fainting spells, shiftless, alcoholic spending sprees, religious crank, alcoholic, and inferior makeup, possibly epileptic, and then an affected maternal grandfather, alcoholic, cranky, stubborn. Okay, so those are examples of the pedigrees that Rosenoff uses to reach the conclusions that this neuropathic trait, which they consider to be indicative of insanity or a vulnerability to insanity, is indeed inherited as an autosomal recessive. So the next step is that in 1913, so about 2 years later, but there must have been some publication lag, David Heron and Carl Pearson write a 3-part series of monograph entitled Mendelism and the Problem of Mental Defect, and they mean this to include both what they would have called mental handicap and psychiatric illness, but Heron is the lead one, and the title of this is A Criticism of Recent American Work, and this is the monograph that directly prompted the New York Times article. And we will, I'm going to just read this briefly. And again, if you want to stop the video and read it in more detail, but this is now from that front page article. And I'll just give you a quote of what I think was written by the reporters in the New York Times. Quote, "A spirited attack has been made by Dr. David Heron of the Galton Laboratory, University College London, upon the entire body of American eugenics in general and the work of the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor under the direction of Dr. Charles B. Davenport in particular. The criticism which finds the work of the American investigator biased, faulty, and exceedingly slipshod is issued in the form of a monograph, the essential content of which is published below, together with a reply by Dr. Davenport himself." So Dr. Heron got most of his monograph published in the New York Times. Not bad. And you can read the rest as you will. So let me try to summarize a fairly lengthy, and I'm going to be simplifying a number of issues and not dealing into everything, but I'm trying to touch the high points here. So what did Heron say about the problems with Davenport's work? And this is both his mental handicap work, which I'm not going through, but almost virtually all of it applies to the study of the insane diathesis as well. Quote, "As a defender of the young science of human genetics, which was at this historical stage nearly inseparable from that of eugenics, Heron describes a critical problem of the defenders, which he sees himself, and of course his mentor, Carl Pearson, of the young field." And now this is a direct quote. "They see, unfortunately, dogma outstripping knowledge. They see fallacious methods of reasoning applied to problems which are essentially statistical by numerous writers who lack the necessary training." So we will see that we're going to be into some sort of heavy, rather personal descriptions in the ensuing monograph. Heron, so let me try to run through substantively what was Heron critiquing in Rosenoff's work. He begins by focusing on the field work itself. And notice here, many of these also apply and use as examples of Davenport's earlier study of feeble-mindedness. First, Davenport published lots and lots of monographs, and one of them was a field manual for interviewers. Again, he hired this team of mostly young women that would go out, identify pedigrees. We don't know anything about the specifics of the assessments, but they did contact them, made personal contact, and that was an important methodological advance. So I don't want to play down some of these important advances. And Davenport did track down Huntington's chorea pedigrees as well as his work in these other areas. But there are some rather concerning quotations from this field manual for interviews. And this is, again, a quotation with a highlight from Heron's monograph itself. And again, I will read this. "Some defects that the field worker will study," and I am quoting Heron's quote of Davenport's monograph for his field workers. So this is his instructions. "Some field workers will study such as albinism and feeble-mindedness are known as recessive defects." So he's assuming that feeble-mindedness, pretty broad phenotype, is recessive. "For example, by hypothesis, feeble-mindedness is for the most part a recessive trait, and the hypothesis must be tested as follows." So he's telling the field workers, how do you test for a recessive disorder? You must find a person suffering from feeble-mindedness who is a descendant of two normal parents. Hypothesis, both of the parents are simplex, meaning heterozygous. The field worker must understand that each parent will probably have somewhere in his or her ancestry a feeble-minded person, and it is the business of the field worker to make a special search for such person or persons in the pedigree. Now you can see why Heron would cry foul. Heron, now quoting from his monograph, Heron says, quote, "It is difficult to understand how the field workers would fail to be prejudiced by these instructions, which appear to be telling the field workers the pedigree structures they are supposed to find." Right? Heron concludes, quote, "What faith are we to place in data collected in this way when we find that the field workers are instructed to, quote, make a special search, unquote, for those individuals who are necessary for the support of the Mendelian theory, and when the data are, quote, indexed in such a way that no exceptions to Mendelian rules can appear." And he is quoting from another version that I didn't want to burden you with, explaining how the field workers have to find pedigrees that don't appear to deviate from the Mendelian expectations. So, pretty hard and well-supported concerns about fieldwork. And next, he addresses the vagueness of the phenotypes that Davenport and colleagues used. And again, Davenport publishes, quote, the trait book of the Eugenics Record Office, which you can also look up, a 52-page listing of the various phenotypes. And these will test my vocabulary here, but this is just from the I's and the L's in most of them here. This is quoting from Heron's quote. These are the phenotypes that they were interested in having their interviewers assess: impracticalness, inadventuresomeness, disheartenedness, unconversationableness, unanecdoteness, ludicrousness versus absence of sense of humor, sublimity versus stolidity, sweetness versus bitterness, coolness and emergency versus loss of head, cooperativeness versus aloofness, and it goes on for page after page after page. Again, quote, the use of term insanity in the titles of these two papers is very misleading, Heron says. Only a comparatively small proportion of the affected individuals are actually insane. These papers deal not with the inheritance of insanity, but with the inheritance of what the authors call a neuropathic condition, which is so comprehensive that it is a matter of surprise that there are any normal individuals at all. You notice a touch of sarcasm in his tone. It is indeed a fortunate circumstance that the Mendelian theory requires the presence of some normal individuals, end quote. And here again is a quote, bear with me, but I think this is important. The neuropathic condition is based upon appearances and conditions manifest from infancy to old age. And the following are some of the conditions with the author's opinion justify classification as neuropathic. And what Heron does in the same that we did is we go through pedigrees, but he went through many more of them. And he obviously is picking out the ones that seems to be particularly unusual. Died in infancy of convulsions, senile deterioration, died of miasmus, Sister of Mercy in Australia said to have died of homesickness, quick-tempered, very queer, lives alone, bores out cats, restless, fidgety, nervous, cold, headache, sick headache, worrier, rambler, neuralgia, insomnia, dictatorial, selfish, not very bright, high-strung, odd, very quiet disposition, lost interest in life, etc. Now, I did my own research here. I picked by random 10 of Rosenoff's pedigrees, and they had 73 affected individuals in those 10 pedigrees, and I classified them using their own description. 21, their main definition was nervous. 13 were described as eccentric or queer, 7 alcoholic, 6 high-strung, 4 cases of dementia precox, which they all were probands, 4 cases of manic depressive insanity, all probands, 4 imbecile or feeble-minded, several of those were probands, and 1 is microcephalic. So I think Heron is right that in the description, the vast majority of individuals in these pedigrees are not severely mentally ill individuals. So terming this the genetics of insanity can be questionable. Okay. Then Heron turns, and this is the hardcore statistical part of the argument, to 2 ascertainment problems. Davenport and Rosenoff never correct for the proband through which they ascertain the pedigrees, thus biasing upward rates of illness in that SIBship. Those of you that are not familiar should be aware that the early efforts to try to see, especially for recessive patterns for Mendelian traits, that you find families with potential recessive traits and individuals, and this was mostly in the 5 to 8 years right after Mendel was rediscovered, kept getting ratios above 25%. And it was Weinberg, this pediatrician, German physician, who noted that you cannot count the affected individual. He developed what is his so-called proband correction method, which, by the way, Ruden adopts in his methods. But it does appear that neither Rosenoff nor Davenport were aware of this, and the fact that counting the affected person, as they always do in the ratios, is going to bias upward in a substantial way. So that's problem 1. Second, they don't correct for the fact that larger SIBships have many more affected and are likely to be ascertained. And we, in fact, one of the pedigrees we saw was doubly ascertained, and they didn't, those have to be counted independently, which again, Weinberg points out, to get the correct segregation ratios. Now, interestingly, Heron doesn't raise the problem that they don't correct for age. So that an individual who is unaffected and 25 years old, unaffected and 50 years old, probably should be counted differently. And by any criteria, you will find that if you're trying to get a Mendelian segregation ratios for age-dependent penetrant phenomena and you don't correct for age, you're going to distort things. But Heron was not apparently aware of that, although Ruden was. So Heron's summary. We believe that those who dispassionately consider the papers discussed in this criticism must conclude that the present writer, that the material has been collected in an unsatisfactory manner, that the data have been tabled in a most slipshod fashion, and that the Mendelian conclusions drawn have no justification whatever. And when we find such teachings based on the flimsiest of theories and on the most superficial of inquiries, and noticing the rather ad hominem attacks here, proclaimed in the name of eugenics and spoken of as entirely splendid work, we feel it is not possible to use criticism too harsh, nor words too strong in repudiation of advice, which, if adopted, must mean the death of eugenics. Think also human genetics as a science. Okay, so that is Heron's response. Now I'm going to go through much more briefly the comments of Carl Pearson, who wrote the other two monographs. Pearson was far more diplomatic in his comments. I'm only going to point out two things. One, he notes that especially the mental defect sections, that really treating this as a dichotomy is probably not reasonable, and that it's better understood as a continuous trait. And in fact, Pearson and the Galton lab did a number of correlational-based studies of estimates of intelligence and mental handicap. And then he also expresses concern about the phenotypic assessments, and as we saw, the assumption, which got counted in there, of heterozygote status without evidence. That is the circular reasoning of counting the heterozygotes obligatorily, which assumes the transmission pattern you're trying to test. So now let's get into Davenport's response. Now this is in fact from the New York Times directly, and then we'll get into the monograph. But I think we can begin to get the tone of how Davenport responded here. Quote, "A sweeping condemnation of American work in the science of eugenics is issued by the Galton Laboratory of University College under the direction of Dr. Carl Pearson. The specific criticism of American methods and American findings being presented by Dr. David Heron." Note the nationalism implied here. "This condemnation, which finds the contribution of America based on worthless, slipshod research and filled with unwarranted conclusions, is based chiefly on the Eugenics Record Office bulletins. Being myself responsible for the work of the Eugenics Record Office, which includes not only the actual laboratory work done at Cold Spring Harbor during the past 3 years, but the active collaboration of institutions and individual scientists throughout the country, think Rosenoff, I feel that it is my task to explode the false and injurious impressions sure to be created in the popular mind by the broadcast criticism issued from the Galton laboratories." So again, pretty directly attacking. Now let's switch to a couple of months later. So Davenport didn't really rest on his haunches here. He's published a brief one-page response in Science magazine, which again, you can read. Here's the reference here. But I am going to jump to some quotes from this term, and you can again see the general spirit of the vocabulary. And this is how he begins it. "The all too familiar blessings of Professor Carl Pearson upon Mendelians have recently been continued by his understudy, Dr. David Heron, and directed toward American work in general, and that of the undersigned in particular. Like my colleagues in this country, I should have remained silent under the attacks, knowing that discriminating men of science in this country, as well as in England, recognize their true animus, and that they lie outside the pale of science." And then a couple of other quotes from that short Science article. Quote, "The numerous errors to which he calls attention fall for the most part into 3 categories based on misunderstandings so gross of the critics on the critic's part as to render it difficult to believe they are not intentional. A critic who is guilty of such extensive, stupid, captious, and misleading criticism can hardly expect a scientific consideration of other points he raises." So pretty strong language. "It will be futile as a biologist to attempt to show to the applied statistician his errors." So noting the contrast, biology, good, positive, we're going to get to the biological root. Statistician, you just deal with numbers, not real biological facts. Quote, "Genuine scientific criticism has always been useful in the advancement of science, but friends of Galton must regard it as a tragedy that the fortune of one of the largest minded and most fertile men of science," small digression, Davenport liked Galton a lot. And in fact, Galton was surprisingly ambivalent in this Mendelian biometrician controversy, kind of switching from one side to the other because he liked some of the concept of Mendelian. So Davenport is praising Galton and derogatory toward his main pupil and mentee, Carl Pearson. So Galton should be supporting a laboratory, one of whose leading members, think Pearson, spends much time making elaborate researches into his delusions concerning the blunder of others, instead of making positive discoveries in a field where so little is known and where the need of utilizable knowledge is so great. Okay, so now let's go to the last article I'm going to consider in detail, which is Rosenoff's response. And Rosenoff wrote a longer article in the 1914, so again, moving pretty quickly given publication lag, in the American Journal of Insanity that in 1921 changed its name to the American Journal of Psychiatry that many of us know well. So here's some selected quotes. In reading Dr. Heron's pamphlet, this is now Rosenoff speaking, one is struck first of all by the unusual temper of the attacks apparent on almost every page. The work of Davenport and Weeks, Rosenoff and Orr, Goddard, who worked mostly in mental handicap, and some others are analyzed in a fashion or referred to without a single feature being found in them to be worthy of anything but unreserved condemnation from the critic. He quickly, however, and I think this is the most interesting part, gets to what he sees as the heart of the dispute. And I find it intriguing that it is Rosenoff, the psychiatrist, and not Davenport, the real dyed-in-the-wool geneticist, who make these points. The unfortunate position in relation to the scientific world of the English biometrical school, to which Dr. Heron belongs, may account in some measure for the temper of the attack. They have, by reason of a pride in their own tradition, they think correlations, refused the guidance of the light of Mendelism, continuing to devote their time and labors to the investigation of the heredity of various traits in man, as well as in plants and animals, by purely statistical methods. Note that's not used in a praiseworthy manner. While biologists, note the contrast, while biologists the world over were piling up evidence of observation and experiment, continuously adding to the support of Mendel's theory. Eventually, it came about that the work of the Galton Laboratory has been valued by the scientific world for the development of refined statistical methods and not as biological contribution to the subject of heredity. So Galton really kind of calls it as he sees it. That is the statistics versus biology controversy that I think in many ways fed this scientific and eventually personal controversy. He goes on, Rosenoff then quotes Bateson, who was, up until now, we haven't heard his name, but in the English world, he is the leading member of the Mendelian group that have written very vigorously against Pearson, but not about psychiatric illness by and large. And now we have Rosenoff quoting from Bateson. Of the so-called investigations of heredity, by extension, pursued by extensions of Galton's non-analytic method and promoted by Professor Pearson and the English Biometrical School, it is now scarcely necessary to speak. That such work may ultimately contribute to the development of statistical theory cannot be denied, but as applied to the problems of heredity, the efforts have resulted only in the concealment of that order which it was ostensibly undertaken to reveal. In other words, statistical methods will never get to the true genetic factors. Only the Mendelian approaches will be successful. Final criticism, which focused on Heron's lack of clinical training, suggesting that it is a universal agreement, we'll see. So this was the last from Rosenoff. The burden of proof is upon the critic, who, though a layman, assumes an attitude in relation to a psychiatric issue, i.e. diagnosis, which is in opposition to a view universally held by psychiatrists. That's simply factually incorrect. In fact, most workers in the field at this point would have focused more on this genetic transmission of specific disorders, although some others did emphasize these very broad kinds of diatheses. So coming back to the quote, and if he furthermore attempts to disqualify on the basis of his attitude work which his opinion contains too large a margin of error, he must in addition take the burden of furnishing an acceptable measure of the error before his criticisms can be rendered valid. This our critic has not done. So he's basically saying he's got no business criticizing my psychiatric judgment about the breadth of these phenotypes that he studied. All right, so let me now summarize what I've taken you through. I've left out a lot of detail, but I think I've touched the high points. So first, it's pretty obvious. There's a high level of acrimony, harsh, rather derogatory language on both parties. We've got a mixture of some substantive scientific critiques, but quite a lot of ad hominem attacks. Not the best way to do science. I have to say this is certainly started by Heron, but Davenport and to some extent Bateson give it back in measure, and Rosenoff, still has takes his gloves off to some extent. There are a couple of articles in the reference, one particular contemporary commentator who praises Heron's science, but castigates Heron for this derogatory approach. But it's very interesting. I found an obituary of Heron written by Egon Pearson. That was the little curly-headed kid at the left of the Pearson picture. And he wrote, quote, recently, when I asked Heron how he felt looking back about these years, and I think in his academic career, this controversy was fairly substantial, he replied to the effect that as a young man, he enjoyed a good fight. So I think we get the response from Heron as an older person that he obviously enjoyed some of the more pugilistic intellectual combat that he engaged in and got started with his monograph. I think, having studied this a fair bit, that there's quite substantial evidence that Davenport used biased field methods. And this is true across a number of the monographs. So I think there is circular reasoning in the way he trained field workers, training field workers to go out especially and find the pedigrees that validated their Mendelian assumptions. I think that the phenotypes used and the associated assessment methods simply strain credulity. I don't have time to present to you, and this is a trend of Davenport. Davenport wrote his most notorious monograph, which is called Nomadism or the Wandering Impulse, in which he determined was a sex-linked recessive with affected individuals. And this is, again, I read from his pedigree table, having phenotypes including Western desperado, sailor, traveling salesman, itinerant tinker, canal boat captain, as manifesting this sex-linked recessive trait called nomadism. And again, although this is not pointed out in this debate, several other psychiatrists, including Abraham Myerson, who was an important figure in psychiatric genetics during this time period in America, also strongly disagreed with Rosenoff's very extended diagnostic pattern, saying these are completely implausible. So Heron was not the only one challenging this. There are methodologic errors for Davenport and Rosenoff that are really quite clear-cut. That is, their simple failure to correct for ascertainment biases. This had been published in German by Weinberg a few years before. What can explain that? Given that Davenport, certainly his reputation was based on studying human pedigree. So he was not at that point on the cutting edge of the algebraic problems of how you get Mendelian ratios, and one has to fault him. And again, that no age correction was performed. And here we see the much greater methodologic sophistication of the Luden school compared to what Davenport was doing. So if I had to judge, but you can all reach your independent opinions, Heron is considerably more right than wrong in his critique of Davenport and Rosenoff, and history by and large supports his judgment about the validity of the scientific work, and particularly the claim of a clear demonstration of autosomal recessive inheritance of this so-called diathys that they study. Now, I don't think this forgives Heron's tone, but it is hard for modern readers not to share some skepticism of these methods. To take a step back, what led Davenport and Rosenoff to these misjudgments? My own view is that this was a case of what you might call Mendelian zealotry, an overenthusiasm for Mendelian models that can distort scientific judgment. But again, you should reach your own conclusion. Does this have implications for the subsequent history of psychiatric genetics? Well, I think it does. For example, in the late 1980s, this all followed the 1983 demonstration of linkage to Huntington's chorea by Jim Guzella using RFLPs, there was a rush of interest and enthusiasm of linkage analysis of psychiatric disorders. And these, of course, depend on Mendelian or we call single major locus models of large effect, Mendelian-like transmission. Some of us in the field, a lot's participated, myself included, but who talked about the methodologic difficulties, the fact that we don't have evidence for Mendelian-like segregating pedigrees for these, that we ought to be worried about false positives, and we certainly shouldn't be studying very small numbers of pedigrees. Those of you old enough to know there were 3 very high-profile false report results of Mendelian segregation using linkage analysis, 2 for manic depressive illness in 1987 and 1 for schizophrenia in 1988. And these are the 3 of them: Barone et al., Sherrington et al., and Janice Eglin et al. Very high profile, and then very disturbing to the field. Gradually, the non-replications came in. So in my view, it is hard to underestimate the strength of the lure of Mendelian models then for psychiatric genetics. Psychiatrists are craving widespread scientific credibility. They want to demonstrate that the genetics is appropriate. To find a full Mendelian model is so attractive to interview to this. And this was a time, again, in the 1980s and early 1990s, where twin research was also blossoming. We had the first interview-assessed population-based studies. both with David Fulker at IBG and Lyndon Eaves at VCU. We had wonderful quantitative models fitting these liability threshold models. And I personally experienced tensions between the twin and the molecular researchers, including what you would see at earlier meetings of the World Congress of Psychiatric Genetics. And if I had to characterize, if you were listening to each group critical of the other, you had the two following stereotypes. The Mendelians, mostly people doing linkage analysis, when they want to put down the twin researchers, used this phrase: you're not doing real genetics, you're just looking at statistical models, which of course completely echoes what we saw 60, 70 years earlier in the dilemma that we've seen here between the biometricians and the Mendelians. So really what goes around comes around. What were the twin researchers saying of these people doing linkage analysis, sometimes on 3, 5, or 8 pedigrees? Quote, you're just a starstruck gene jock fitting models that we know don't apply. So we have the same kind of ad hominem attacks between these two fields that have visited us again. So the tension between Mendelian and biometrical genetics has been on the root of psychiatric genetics for several generations now. And you would give me a minute to say, I think there's a deep irony in the evidence that has emerged from GWAS studies in recent years. That is, the Pearson-Fisher model of a normal distribution of liability due to many genes of small effect has actually turned out to be right. So the Mendelians were wrong in all their claims that you're just studying statistics and that real biological understanding is only going to be through classic Mendelian models. And it's very pleasing to see in some important ways through PRS scores, through SAM-GWAS, that we are now seeing a bit of a merger of these fields and have we finally calmed down from this kind of internecine argument that we've had with one another across the generations. So before I conclude, what happened to the main players in this little story? Well, Charles Davenport's work gradually lost influence. He was an ardent eugenicist. He was influential in immigration restrictions of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. He retired in 1934. The Carnegie Foundation, which was really supporting all of this, withdrew the critical support for his Coldstream Harbor Laboratory in 1940, in part because the enthusiasm of the eugenics movement in the United States diminished substantially with the rise of the Nazis in Germany from the mid-1930s on. Davenport did not reduce his enthusiasm for that. David Heron, on the other hand, left academia in 1915 and worked for the insurance company in England. He went on to be president of the Royal Statistical Society and had a distinguished career, but he was not doing this kind of work. Aaron Rosenoff went on to a distinguished academic and administrative career in psychiatry. He led the first US twin studies of schizophrenia and manic depressive illness, so he reverted to more traditional diagnostic-based approaches, and he was sufficiently well known to be appointed the State Commissioner of Lunacy in California in 1933, and wrote a textbook, so he did relatively well for himself. Pearson remained the Galton Chair of Eugenics at University College London until his retirement in 1933. He was at that point, although perhaps a little bit eclipsed by Ronald Fisher, one of the giants of statistical work. And it's the following note: in June of 2020, UCL announced that it was renaming 2 buildings which had been named after Pearson because of connection with eugenics. And for all of these authors, you will read parts of there where they are very enthusiastic about eugenic pressures. And that's a whole other talk. Last word, in the New York Times, Heron got his last point. So this is now January 4th. So it's like a month later. And you can, Dr. Heron accuses head of American Eugenics Record Office of callousness, inconsistency, and misinformation, and says that the following of his advice would mean the death of eugenics as a science. So here is, I am writing a paper on this. So this is an extensive bibliography on this page and last. So again, you can freeze your frame if you want to look at these in detail. And this is a rich area for those of you that have historical interests. And I appreciate your attention. Thank you.